The laptop is too complicated for me. I don't know how to advance the next slide. Oh, there we go. All right. I did. Thanks.
There we go.
Good morning. Thanks for coming. As Mr. Rettel discussed people's passion for internet governance and things like that, I want to share mine. As a measure of my dedication to internet governance and to all of you, I went and saw the new Mission Impossible movie last night for research, because once you get past all of the car chases and helicopter crashes, there's a couple of underlying themes that come to the surface in this very important work of art. One is the inherent challenges of the state to protect the interests of individuals at the same time they're trying to protect their society as a whole. That's one of the important themes. And the other, which you may have seen in the previews, is that before there can be peace, there has to be a great suffering. And we know that with the Industrial Revolution, that was the case. And so I wonder whether we'll be able to sidestep that level of suffering in the transition that lies ahead of us today. We have a great panel to discuss sort of the future of work, and what we're trying to do is have that in the context of internet governance. So if you are ever in Washington, you know that there's a future of work panel every day, basically, at this point. And so we're trying very hard to use internet governance as the vector, the window into that conversation. Before I get too far, I want to thank the organizers of the panel, Ramela El-Karzari, Judith Hellerstein, John Moore, Robert Winterton, and then I want to especially call out Mike Nelson and Andrew Mack, who were really principal in constructing the scenarios that we're going to be discussing. We've got a great panel for you. You have bios in front of you, so I'll just mention people briefly. We have Stewart Baker, who's a partner at Steptoe & Johnson. For purposes of our conversation, he's our cybersecurity expert. We have Marjory Blumenthal, who's the senior policy analyst at RAND Corporation, who's done a lot on the impact of technology on education, training, how information technology might affect new cities, et cetera. I think that's going to be very exciting as well. Larry Irving, most of you know, the former NTIA administrator for nearly 7 years, I guess, something like that, and has a lot of knowledge about the intersection of government and the internet and how those two coexist, which we'll be talking about quite a bit. And finally, Andrew Mack from Agrimobile, a new startup, agricultural transportation startup. So one of the things we're trying to do is go through a set of scenarios that you all have in front of you at your table, and basically look at the two main drivers, if you will, for what internet governance might look like and what these scenarios might be as we move into the sort of next phase of our economy, if you will. One is the level of government regulation, and what is the degree to which the government will respond to changes in the economy with regulation, just as Mr. Rettel suggested we would try to limit. And the other is what level of fragmentation will we see of the internet? How open will it remain, or what is the degree to which it'll become fragmented as an attempt to try and sort of accommodate or fix issues that come up as a result of the changes that we're seeing? So what we have up here is a kind of a 4-quadrant diagram, which anybody's ever been to business school or know someone that has, you've seen many of these. And you can see that there's these two axes, right? The amount of US regulation and the amount of fragmentation that sort of naturally falls out of that, these 4 scenarios that we're going to try and discuss today. And everything is a question of degree. Nothing is meant to be the last word. And in fact, as Shane mentioned at the opening, we really want you to participate in this conversation. We're going to try to make it really move along if we can. But feel free to question the underlying drivers, any of the assumptions that are made as part of this discussion, because they're meant to be straw men for purposes of discussion. So please engage actively. We have the microphone runners. We may not let them hand you the microphone because we're going to try to keep things moving, but we want to hear from you for sure. In order to get us started, even though you have the scenarios in front of you, I'm going to ask Andrew Mack to briefly go over each scenario. We'll talk to the panelists a little bit about if they want to add any color commentary before we get going, and then we're going to kind of hold a vote about all of you to see, and what's going to happen is that Glenn here is going to take a picture of the room, and that'll be our way to count the vote later. So we'll take a vote before and after and see if there's a change in what you feel of the likelihood of each of these scenarios is. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew. You're mic'd up and everything like that, so go ahead with scenario 1.
Can everyone hear me? Can you hear?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. And imagine me reading these in dramatic voice so you get a sense of the true scenarios. One of the things that we've done also is we've tried very hard to present these scenarios as a combination of positives and negatives. So the way that we'll do this, I'll read a quick blurb about the scenario and then lay out some positives and then some negatives. We'll go through it this way. So the first scenario is called Techlash. In that scenario, the internet and social media are blamed for a wide range of problems such as cyberbullying, intellectual property theft, election meddling, and cyber espionage. In the scenario, US policymakers have become more inclined to regulate the internet, citing national security and the need to protect its citizens, consumers, particularly in the interest in national security. Since many of the largest global internet and cloud players are based in the US, domestic policy decisions have global impact. Policies introduced include things like mandated encryption backdoors, blocking the transfer of American user data to foreign countries, country-specific limits on foreign investments, and others. Other countries retaliate, imposing their national rules. And startups find it harder to bear the cost of new regulations. A few dominant tech companies emerge that are strictly held to account and heavily regulated by all levels of government. In this scenario, there are a series of positives. National security could be improved, cyber espionage prevented, as there's limited access to US data by untrustworthy foreign actors. Fewer data breaches could occur due to the very punitive measures against companies with poor cybersecurity practices. Established industries are less threatened by new entrants, foreign or domestic. And consumers may feel more protected, consumers and workers. On the other hand, there are some real negatives. Innovation slows and US tech companies play a smaller international role. The US market becomes less global as regulations on international trade make it more costly. US technology may not be globally accessible, and new foreign technologies may not be available in the US. And lower productivity and limited markets will mean fewer new jobs and the possibility of wage stagnation, especially in the tech sector.
So before I go in, I want to just not put you on the spot, but if anyone on the panel wants to add any color, but try to avoid giving your opinion about the likelihood of the scenario, because we're going to try to get a vote and we don't want to bias anybody. But if you've got any color to add about the drivers, et cetera, that you want to add, here's an opportunity for you before we go on. So I just wanted to, no? Yes?
I would just make one comment.
Sure.
That the way the scenario is worded, obviously, and given this group, obviously puts a spotlight on the tech sector. But there are actually jobs outside of the tech sector. And one can reasonably ask whether if the tech sector were to be constrained somewhat, maybe there would be some opportunities elsewhere. And it's worth considering what those opportunities are, perhaps in neighborhoods that are less familiar to us.
So I guess I would say that as you think about what might drive this, you could imagine a situation where an entire election turns on social media's failure to control the data that it is collecting, and it's misused by foreign governments, and an entire party decides that social media is evil and deserves whatever Washington serves up to it. And at the same time, social media could be systematically suppressing conservative speech so that the entire right half of the spectrum thinks that social media is evil and deserves whatever Washington serves up to them. That might drive some regulation.
Okay. All right, thank you. Andrew, why don't you proceed to the second one?
The next scenario is called wide open. Under this scenario, government regulation is very limited. The global internet is available to all workers and all companies with access to great choice, for free or low-cost services. There are few government restrictions on startups, with few limits on the use of user data. At least for many workers, businesses, and consumers have easy access to new tools and technology. The on-demand and peer-to-peer economies are fast-growing, and for consumers, most products and services are readily available with the push of a button. The changing economy requires some human support staff, but despite new jobs in automating industries like customer service, many workers have decreasing access to traditional employment. Some displaced workers find more work in the peer-to-peer and on-demand economies. But importantly, statistics fail to show how engaged and satisfied these workers are. Traditional means of measuring employment are inadequate to capture this new reality. Government decides to replace binary unemployment statistics with new measures like worker engagement and satisfaction. Under this scenario, series of positives. Fast innovation with large portions of the tech industry, we have tech industry profits being reinvested in research and development. Consumers, businesses, and workers are presented with large numbers of choices for the services, and those services tend to be well integrated. Acquisitions by big tech companies make some successful innovators really rich, really fast. And employment opportunities are widespread, enabling young people to work in several different jobs at once or in succession before deciding on a specific career path. On the other hand, there are some negatives. Governments face pressure to update welfare, education, healthcare, and licensing regulations, but political disagreements cause delays. Our capacity for change are slow. Sometimes companies innovate faster than they can prepare best practices, increasing the reach of things like data breaches and fraud, unemployment malpractice, and the poor treatment of workers and consumers. And workers who struggle to adapt to this new risk-taking entrepreneurial economy may struggle. They may miss out on some of the benefits.
Yeah, I have an interesting anecdote. My Uber driver on the way over here was actually managed the process of installing all the glass at CSIS. So it was a pretty interesting coincidence and an awful lot of glass, and maybe used up all the glass in the city and is now finding alternative means of employment via Uber. Is there any color that you want to add in terms of drivers, et cetera, that on this scenario?
So I guess when I look at Wide Open, I guess that was the teletopian vision that many of us had, 25, 30 years ago when we first started looking at this. And I think one of the things that is not listed as a negative, but I think that one of the things folks are coming up with now is that our income inequality has never been broader in Western society than it is today. And at least in the United States, what's happening in New York, Austin, Silicon Valley is a driver of that income inequality. And thinking about that, I think, is one of the things we have to look at. That we got a lot right, but it's an interesting question that poses for the society.
Right. I'd also add one more point, which is the idea that the ability to start a company does not necessarily translate into the ability or the need to hire a lot of workers. If you think about Pinterest, who went for IPO with, I think, 17 employees or something like that. The simple fact is that we have to measure this on two variables. Number one is how open are we, how much can we innovate, but also what's the impact on employment. And they may or may not be the same.
And I guess one other piece of that is the ability to start a company doesn't necessarily mean you can get the investment for the company or have an exit strategy if you have that company. And Wide Open might exacerbate some of that too, because you'll have larger companies that may be more dominant. The ability for somebody to, when I go out to the Valley, and I spend about a quarter of my life out there, a number of the VCs are expressing some concern about their ability to develop an exit strategy that doesn't involve the FANGs. If it doesn't involve the FANGs, you probably can't get money, and you probably won't get money in the back end.
Right. All right, Andrew, go ahead.
Great. Our third scenario is called Focus on Home. In it, a handful of US tech companies hold large market share in their particular industries, and millions of US citizens feel and are reliant on them for their services. Data leaks from these companies alongside accusations of unsupportive or even toxic work environments puts increasing pressure on foreign governments to, quote, rein in, unquote, American tech titans. As a result, they create policies that target US tech firms, such as restrictions on data collection, taxation, media regulation, and others. Some US tech firms decide to dial down their foreign investments, instead focusing on the large US domestic market. Punitive regulations and inefficient market structures abroad limit the reach of foreign tech companies, and few establish themselves enough to compete with the dominant US tech companies on a global stage. In this scenario, there are three positives. There's limited access to US data by untrustworthy foreign actors. While foreign companies may copy US intellectual property, their lack of presence in the US and the lack of US tech presence in foreign countries prevents large-scale IP theft. And the US economy grows much faster compared to other more restricted countries, and US technological dominance, therefore, is mostly locked in. On the negative side, transnational companies and their employees find it hard to collaborate effectively across national markets, slowing their growth and productivity. The internet feels less global, and some markets are left out as technology in the US continues to advance. Global inequality, the digital divide, begins to grow. The loss of profitable access to foreign markets limits growth for US tech companies and for the wider economy, and here I'd add also for smaller economies that want to be international. And the lack of domestic competition from foreign tech companies limits consumer and business choice, undermining the incentive for US tech companies to innovate.
All right, any color? All right, pretty scary scenario.
So I guess I feel constrained to note that I think even if US companies focus on home, the rest of the world's not going to stop innovating and developing their own solutions. When you look at what's happening in Africa, you look at what's happening in Asia, we've gone from, I was David Reddle 25 years ago, and there were 15 million people on the internet and fewer than 100 million people had mobile devices. We're now at, 4 billion people on the internet and 7 billion mobile devices. We can focus on home. That's not going to change what the rest of the world does.
And I think I would just add, to picking up on your example from Africa, when we started working in Nigeria, there were 20,000 cell phones, and now there's a cell phone for every man, woman, and child in a 200 million person economy. It's hard, it stretches my imagination to think that even in a more focused on home kind of environment, we leave that market off of our planning.
All right, thanks, one more.
Okay, last one is called rules for innovation. Under this scenario, Yeah, that's right. Under this scenario, a handful of US tech companies own large portions of domestic market share in digital infrastructure and services. Governments concerned about their unchecked influence on the US economy intervene in markets, attempting to protect consumers and guarantee competition. Policies implemented include things like net neutrality regulations on both telecommunications and edge providers, data ownership or portability requirements, and rigorous antitrust enforcement. Local governments also begin to play a larger role in regulating how technologies are locally implemented, including restrictions on peer-to-peer and on-demand economies to protect local businesses. Positives for this scenario. In a world with limited competition, workers wouldn't have to learn how to use the new and different digital tools all the time. They'd stick with updates of the ones that they know. Governments have a goal of trying to balance innovation, consumer welfare, and stability as a stated goal. Checks on innovation would mean that workers vulnerable to technological change, such as those without transferable skills, might feel more secure. Work may be more stable, jobs less likely to be threatened by disruptive new technologies and business models. And the public generally might feel more in control of their relationship with technology and are less concerned about changes in the economy and how their data is handled and its ramifications on society broadly. On the negative side, costly regulations are just that, they're costly. They limit the payout from new technologies, hinder innovation, particularly in areas that require large capital expenditure. Lobbying by established industries could harm competition in new tech. Increases in the cost of compliance could undermine US startup culture, and workers dissatisfied with their current employment might feel less empowered to start up their own innovative businesses. And Chinese and other international companies who work and operate in environments that are comparatively less regulated might begin to take a larger share of the tech market, both overseas and in the United States.
Right, so it sort of begs the question about whether the government's going to be able to help tech companies and non-tech companies, as you mentioned, at the same time, or will those things be in conflict? One of the things that we want to do now, we'll call it a first inning stretch, is what I want to do is take a kind of an informal vote here about what you think the likelihood of each of these scenarios is. So which scenario you think is most likely to happen of the four, and I was hoping that you would vote by just standing up at your seat if you're feeling up for that. And Glenn's going to take your picture, and we'll be able to compare these later and do an actual count, because then we'll have a discussion about it and see if you feel differently by the end of the discussion. So on that first scenario that involves this tech clash that you heard at the beginning, how many of you think that's the most likely of the four scenarios, understanding that everything's a matter of degree and things like that? What was the question? Yeah, which one of the four scenarios do you find most likely to occur? So if you think tech clash is the one most likely to occur, go ahead and stand up. All right, interesting. I'm going to take down your names. All right, so
Facial recognition technology.
exactly.
You don't need to-
You got that, Glenn? Thank you. All right, wide open. So low government regulation and a very open internet. Teletopia. All right. Focus on home. Right. Turn our attention inward, away from the international arena, and focus on just the United States. Great. And then finally, this rules for innovation. The government really trying to take a real role in balancing the interests of the tech industry and the. All right. Thank you very much, and thank you, Glenn. All right, so we wanted to keep you from giving too many biasing opinions for the vote in terms of what you think is the most likely scenario, or where you think the strongest drivers are. But now I want to just go through the panel and get your sense, your verbalized vote, if you will, about these scenarios and where you think we're headed, and particularly in the context of the future of work, right? So I mean, that's an interesting part of this discussion. We're trying to look at what the implication is going to be for people, for jobs, et cetera, but through this window of internet governance. So if you want to go ahead and go first, just give your sense of these and where you think we're headed.
So I think under almost any one of these scenarios, you've got enormous companies in a political environment, and then you have the rest of us. And I kind of imagine what the future of work would have been like if instead of work it was the future of species when man first appeared in the savannah. You can imagine God saying, yeah, we don't have a lot of openings left for apex predators. You guys aren't going to make it. Herbivores, large herbivores, no, maybe a couple. But rodents, oh, we have so many openings for rodents. And I think those are the job prospects for practically everybody. You get to be a rodent in a world that big tech dominates. And as long as you don't aggravate big tech, they won't poison you. And you can make a good living, pretty good living. Somebody once said globalization means that we all get to make a good living from the point of view of a Pakistani hod carrier. And there is some of that. We're all going to be competing with the third world for almost everything. And so I think that produces hostility to big tech, not surprisingly. And that means lots of regulation, and the regulation is inevitably local, which means that we're sliding rapidly toward tech clash.
All right, tech clash.
I agree that it's hard to see a future, at least at the moment, that doesn't involve the big tech firms. But I do wonder about the opportunities that are a little bit farther afield. I think a lot of the description here focuses on people who embrace tech, are comfortable with tech, except for that last one, referring to people who are uncomfortable with tech. But we do have a lot of people who are never going to be entrepreneurs. And we have a lot of people who are never going to do truly intellectual work. So finding ways to allow everybody to get some kind of fulfillment in work can be shaped by these parameters, really, for setting up who is in the economy, who wins in the economy, what the alternatives are, what happens with competition, and so on. I think that even if on a national basis we don't focus on home, or regardless of how much we focus on home, at least in this country we can see a bit of a shift from the national stage, which is certainly where I focus, to a lot more activity happening at state and local levels. And once you look at those, you see different kinds of opportunities. So you see the Internet of Things arising for environmental management, for helping to balance, stormwater runoff and sewage use of the same pipes, to take a Pittsburgh example. There are new opportunities for educating people, which, in fact, if you take the big tech companies, there are now these ads promoting YouTube for self-education, but there's a lot of reality to that. So as I look at these scenarios, I expect that there will be a lot of surprises, and that even if most of us are rodents, that's another way of saying we're resilient and we can cope. And part of the challenge of thinking about employment is it's always easier to see what is going to be displaced, and we can see that, but I am somewhat optimistic that, especially with a more local focus, we'll come up with some new alternatives.
A lot of openings for cockroaches, too.
Listening to your comments, there was a great article in either yesterday's Times or Post about the genius of rats. And if you haven't read it, you realize, I don't know why we're on rats and rodents, but it was a fascinating article about how resilient and entrepreneurial rats actually are. Scary. As I look at this, at these different scenarios, I read something like 2 days ago that 100 years ago, 50% of the American workforce was engaged in agriculture. 100 years ago. So my mother is 89 this year. My grandmother would have been 106, 107 this year. And so basically their lifetimes, we went from a society where half the workforce was engaged in some type of agriculture farm to basically an industrial society. Now we're moving to an information society. So this happens pretty fast. And so when I'm looking at these scenarios, I assume that what's going to happen, and not just because it's color coordinated, that something between rules of innovation for innovation and wide open. Because I think we are basically an optimistic country and an optimistic people, and I think we actually believe in progress. But I also believe that most folks feel that we've not adequately protected workers, not adequately protected competition, not adequately protected new entrants and innovation. I don't think we'll ever get fully focused on home, and I think Techlash would require too much heavy lifting by too many people who don't understand what they're lifting.
That's Washington, isn't it?
Yes and no. I mean, generally people try to make informed decisions even when they're wrong decisions, and I think the beauty of the Facebook hearings before the Senate. I'll exclude the House because that's where I spent most of my life as a youngster, is that both sides America realized that both sides had some real problems. The lack of candor and honesty and openness from Facebook was alarming, I think, to some of us. And I think the lack of knowledge about the rudimentary underpinnings of that industry was alarming to anybody who cares about the policy. But let me finish where I was going to go. And I was in Australia early this year, and I did 2 maps. And one map showed the communities in America that had broadband. And then another map showed the communities, and this was before a group of folks like us, tech people, talking about, look at America, the areas that have broadband, they were all in blue. The next day I was giving a political speech to some elected officials in Australia, and I had not looked at the 2 maps side by side, and that map showed the counties won by Donald Trump. When I look at those 2 maps together, it's an interesting thing. Those communities that have adopted and accepted and engaged in broadband almost were all blue, both on that map and in the electoral map. So we have this disconnect that it's not just that America is split politically, we're split in terms of how we look at, view, and embrace and use technology. And that's why I think we're going to have to look at rules for innovation. We've got to figure out, how we make this revolution a truly national revolution, how we make sure that every American really feels invested in that, and I don't think we're there yet. And the right answer is the right answer for 360 million Americans, not the right answer for 5 or 6 or 7 companies and the people who invest to fund them. And one last piece, that Uber driver you were speaking about, that Uber driver has less protections than, my dad had an 8th grade education and moved up Virginia to New York City and worked as a civil servant. When you think about retirement, health care, quality of life, he had more protections in the 50s and 60s as a black guy with an 8th grade education than most of the folks in the gig economy who are working these gig jobs do today. And that's something I think is going to require us to rethink a lot of the precepts that we've had over the last 5 or 6 years with regard to workers in tech.
Right, and so that might be a less employer-centric view of that as well, though, too, right? That's I guess part of what's interesting about this is that it's not just about everyone being an entrepreneur, but it might be about an environment of greater personal agency, where people, by definition, must be more in control of their future than they've had to be historically, right? And so in that environment, the people are a little bit more on their own than they were, prior to the Industrial Revolution.
But I think what Larry is also saying, and you can correct me, is that if there is an adequate safety net, then it may be a little bit easier to have that agency.
Yeah, I think that, we go to society, we're going to see this in the next 5 to 6 years. Baby boomers, and I'm one of them, I'm right in the middle of baby boomers, are way underinvested in their retirement. And we're about to hit that. If we have another recession, there are a lot of people who are going to have a lot of problems who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s because they just don't have enough, because we've gotten rid of organizations taking care of your pension, and people are self-investing and they're underinvesting. The healthcare issues are going to be, are dominating the election for just this year. My Uber driver yesterday, we're talking about this because we were getting rid of this panel. It's like, if I get hit, it's my car. My dad was a cab driver part-time. There was a fleet of cars, and he didn't have to worry about being out of work if his car got hit, because the fleet of cars would take care of it. If he had a cold, he had some sick days that the cab company would take care of. We've gotten rid of a lot of the safety net things that came in the 30s and 40s and 50s. We've decided we don't need, or these haven't been developed in this new economy. I think we've got to think about those things, because we are invested as a society in each other's well-being, I would hope.
Well, and you think about it, I'm not sure I want to be a rodent or a cockroach. We have, on a cultural basis,
I'm pretty sure I don't want
two themes that are a little bit in conflict right now. You've got, on the one hand, the fact that many people are going to be less economically important. The things that they make may or may not be as valuable. And then at the same time, we have a kind of a predator culture where you want to be an entrepreneur, you want to start your own thing, you want to be, you're an actor. And to some extent, I wonder whether the way that we think about work may need to change. As an entrepreneur, as someone who's launching an ag tech startup, one of my big concerns is these large companies, will they be my friends or will they be competitors of mine? Because once we sit down with them, they can do in a fraction of the time what we could do, what most startups can do, and that's I think a legitimate concern for people who come up with a good idea, who want it, if there's so much concentration. To the question about agriculture and all the way that we illicit, we forget that around the world there are 500 million small farms. So that's not necessarily the cornerstone of our employment economy here in the United States any longer. But there are 1.5 billion people who live in these small farm communities. That's the largest country on earth, right? And so we do have to make the transition and think about it not just in terms of the United States, but also in terms of the rest of the world's economy. There are future markets.
So what I want to do is challenge you to think less aspirationally about what you think ought to happen, and what do you think the drivers are, and what do you think is actually going to happen. Because certainly we didn't handle the Industrial Revolution, even though sort of things turned out, that transition was pretty painful for individuals that got displaced by that transition. And so us saying we need a safety net, do you believe that that's the way that we're going? Do you think that a traditional, that's a government-led initiative, or is it more about, again, freeing up healthcare, et cetera, to be more applicable to individuals and less applicable to employees, et cetera? Is there something that is more accommodating to what the next phase looks like, as opposed to looking backward and saying, well, you know, I really miss the days when we had pensions? Is there a way to rethink about what that looks like going forward, rather than always trying to drag ourselves back to the golden era when everything was fine and half the population voted, right? So I think there's always a danger of like looking backwards for our solutions instead of looking at what our future context is going to look like and designing our solutions in that context. So I want to push back a little bit on our aspirations and then say, what do you think are the drivers that are happening right now, and do you think we're headed in the right direction, and what direction do you think we're headed in as far as these scenarios, as opposed to where you'd like us or believe that we ought to normatively end up? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I don't want to go ahead. I don't want to dominate. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, I actually wanted to pick up on something that Larry had said before, because I think an important driver is the aging of the population. And a lot of those small farms are in the southern hemisphere, and the age structures are different from what we have here. So there will be employment in elder care, and there will be employment in service industries of different kinds. You know, whether we can meet the needs adequately, that's a whole other story. The role of technology, that's a whole other story. But I think that something that's not in here that is an important driver is aging. To respond to your question, I will acknowledge some of my limitations when it comes to certain aspects of economics, but I do not see the government as a solution for the financial security that people need growing older. So the question of whether there can be new, creative, flexible mechanisms that some segments of the private sector, perhaps in partnership with the government, can forge to help lubricate these transitions, that's an open question. I don't know that anybody is looking at those issues except perhaps some foundation-sponsored research, but it's open.
And what do you think is likely, is the question?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know if, it's clear that Silicon Valley design solutions for their problems, right? Taxi service in San Francisco sucks, so we get Uber. Anybody here who ever had a secretary?
Just to be clear about it, it was pretty bad.
It was uniquely bad in San Francisco. Outlook is constantly making my secretary redundant. It's forcing me to do the work that my secretary used to do because nobody at Microsoft has secretaries. They envision the world through their own lens. If you're not in that world, you don't really exist for them. And the solution that they're coming up with out of Silicon Valley is some kind of income maintenance solution, right? Well, everybody should have a guaranteed income, which I gotta say feels like a kind of half contemptuous tip to people who can't make it. It's like, yeah, oh well, here, take that. And I think that's where we're headed, is that they will continue to develop a world in which people who are not like them don't matter and are just paid off to shut up.
Okay, those are strong words. Those are fighting words.
So let me try.
Again, what I want to do, and as we open the conversation up more broadly, let's try not to spend the day talking about universal basic income, for example, because let's talk about internet governance, and that's the purpose of these scenarios. It is just meant to be a window or a vector into this conversation, not something that's going to encompass every aspect of the future of work. So in other words, what's the role of internet governance in terms of fragmentation of the internet, the amount that we're going to be regulating technology on the internet, the export of encryption technology, all those kinds of things that we've gone through in the past. Let's, if we can, to some extent, fuzzy boundaries, think about things through the vector of internet governance. Yeah.
So I think over the next few years, we're going to have a national conversation or a global conversation about how we think about these policies. You've got Nancy Pelosi has asked Ro Khanna, who's probably uniquely situated to do this because he's from Santa Clara, he's been at the Department of Commerce, he's a young guy who's relatively progressive, and he's going to start looking from a progressive perspective, what should the internet principles be, internet bill of rights for consumers. That's one piece of it. We've got Gail Slater and David Redl and others in the administration who are looking at privacy. And they're looking at privacy both from the perspective of Americans have a different history with regard to privacy than Europe does. If you're in Germany and you had the Stasi for 50 years and you had the Nazis for 20 before that, your concern about privacy is very different than Americans do. But it doesn't mean it's wrong, it means it's different, and we need to have our own American perspective. We're looking at a rapidly changing workforce and competition policy. We talked about, I know Amazon's a sponsor, and I'm not beating up on Amazon, but is Amazon a friend or a predator if you're, let's say you're Duracell or you're Eveready? So for years, people would, I get my batteries, and rather than schlep down to Costco, I'd go online and Amazon would send me batteries. Well, now Amazon knows when I get batteries, what batteries I get, and how often I get batteries. And then I'd get Eveready Duracell. And then Amazon decides that it wants to have Amazon batteries. And they send me an email saying, hey, by the way, Mr. Irving, you get batteries. If you get our batteries, you get them for half the price of Duracell. If you're Duracell, that can't be a good thing. And from a competition policy standpoint, how should we look at that? And multiply that by all the other sectors of our economy that Amazon's, they know more about your customer than between your customer, and 50% of all online commerce is going through Amazon. Should we maybe have a competition policy around that? And the point I'm trying to make is, somebody in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, if they're smart, will sit down and look at all of these different vectors and say, we need a comprehensive thought of how we think about this and how we think it impacts workers. What does it mean? We're losing hundreds of thousands of retail jobs. You can walk into any store in the country and see fewer people. We're creating hundreds of thousands of retail jobs in distribution centers. Now, would I rather be, the person selling you a suit at Nordstrom or the guy hauling packages around in the back end of an Amazon warehouse? That's an existential question I hope I never have to answer. But that is a question that we're seeing shifts in these things. So little towns in Indiana where there are Amazon retail centers are booming, and Fifth Avenue in New York, you're seeing a whole bunch of folks who's going to work in suits who don't have jobs in these stores that are going, the storefronts are going away. Who's having those conversations? And my point it's not aspirational, it's my belief that if either party wants to survive politically, they're going to have to start thinking about these things holistically. And one of the good things we did in 1993 and 94 and 95, when I was back in government, is we did look at these holistically, and none of us yet have talked about voice recognition or AI or IoT, which adds a whole nother level of complexity and will change us even more with regard to competition, with regard to jobs, and with regard to economic policy. So if we're not looking at this between now and 2020, why do we have a government? Because these are the, I think, critical issues, domestic, and then over the international implications, because whatever Amazon, Facebook, Google do, we've got Baidu, JD.com, Tencent, and Alibaba, and they're not just competitors, they have a very different viewpoint, and I know I certainly don't want everything I do being sucked up, not just by a company, but by a government, and then government giving me social credits on top of that, and if we're not exploiting our values as Americans, as Western democracies on these issues, we're going to see a world in which Chinese values on these issues dominate, and I'm not sure that's a good thing either.
I would just add, I think I couldn't agree with you more. I sense that there's both a pro and a con.
Yes.
There's certainly the danger. There's also tremendous power in data, and there's tremendous power in data from people who have not been polled in the past, right? And one of the things I think we're going to need to figure out is, very much in the context of internet governance, what are the models for sharing? What are and how to give people a sense of enough ease and enough security, and at the same time to be connected with the rest of the world. If we don't have a good model for it, other models will come out. So we really have to figure out how we're going to present ourselves so that we can be entrepreneurial on a global scale.
We don't have a choice here about which companies we're going to be dealing with and whose values we're going to be dealing with. There are only two choices now. Only two economies have the scale to deal with this. There's China's internet economy, and there's Silicon Valley's internet economy. There's never going to be a European internet economy, and the African internet economy is much more likely to look like rodents than like apex predators. And so that's going to drive us. If you don't like Chinese values being imposed through consumer products made by Baidu, then you are dragging us toward a fractured internet, which everybody here probably thinks is a bad idea, but which, when you present it as us versus Chinese values, they applaud. We're going to end up dividing up the world, and my guess is that that means that we're going to be excluding Chinese products here because we don't like the values that come with them.
I don't know if it's the values that come with them. I think it's about the government scrutiny of my activities that come with them. That's the problem. So whether that's a value or an activity, I'm not sure. It's a semantic issue. And I don't know whether a fractured internet is a good thing or a fragmented internet is a good thing or a bad thing. I spent 30 years of my life trying to create a holistic internet environment, and China may think it's in their interest to have a different, and Iran is certainly going to have a different, and different countries will make their own decisions. My point is that we have an opportunity as a nation, as a group of nations, Western democracies, to think about how we want to approach these issues, and I don't know that enough thought is being given to it. And I certainly think that one of the things about America from 1990, which when I first started hearing about the internet, to today, is we didn't just lead in terms of internet policy and technology policy because we had the best products, because we also had the best ideas. If you look at the agenda for action that Al Gore released in September of 1993, and it'll be 25th anniversary, and I'm doing some writing on that right now, that agenda for action in 1993, everything we talked about then has been kind of the foundational approach the rest of the world has used in looking at internet policy. And now we're at an inflection point where we're beginning to see tugs in other directions, and if we don't rethink that 25-year-old set of principles, we've got some problems going forward.
So again, I'm going to just very briefly push back a little bit because, because you are being very articulate about what we ought to be doing and don't believe that we are. And you said if we don't do it, and we will have problems. And that's where I'm getting at with the scenario. So absent of change of course, where is it that you think we're going briefly? I mean, that's the where are we headed? Where are we headed in terms of a scenario if we don't change course, if we don't do the heavy thinking that you're suggesting, et cetera? What do you think is the path that we are on today?
I think we'd be on regional heavy-handed regulation, and I think we'd be on intensely fragmented internet policy. And I think that's problematic for a number of reasons, and I would assume that most folks in this room would feel the same way.
That's right. Okay, so what I'd love to do is get you all to participate. We don't exactly have a round table discussion here. We've got a big crowd, but I'd really love to hear from all of you, both in terms of questioning all the assumptions that you've heard thus far, and your views on, we had an interesting mix of votes on which scenario was most likely. I want to hear why you think so, et cetera, and make your case. But let's try and keep it tight. In terms of your comments. So microphone holders, hold on to the microphone and just hold it in front of people, and we're going to enforce a discipline of whoop. All right, so we're going to start in the back here with Marilyn Cade. And introduce yourself, please, whenever you speak for the transcript record.
I actually think it's okay if I hold the line.
Because you're Marilyn Cade.
I promise not to eat it. My name is Marilyn Cade, and I spend most of my time working with the ICT sector in developing countries. So my question to all of you, I have a quick comment. My observation is, boy, we were very US-centric in most of the discussion. And my question to you is really, and it kind of goes to a point that you made, Larry, about, we didn't just have good technology, but we had good ideas, and we worked very, very hard to build friends internationally. We cannot live in an ecosystem island called North America. So what's your thought on how we do the best we can to achieve the best outcome for the world that also reflects on the best outcome for the U.S.?
All right.
You
You want to take that quickly? Yeah, I want to try and get as many people speaking as possible. So,
I'll do it real quickly.
I'll do it quickly. I think the most likely outcome for the next 10 years is a pretty brutal competition between the Chinese version of the internet and Silicon Valley's version of it. And especially in the mobile internet, China has enormous advantages in Africa in particular. And so the US is going to have to struggle to have Silicon Valley's model survive.
I wouldn't go Silicon Valley's model. I'd say we need a U.S. model. We need to think about what that model should be. We should include Silicon Valley in the discussions. We should have a message, and we should start working as hard over the next 5 years as we did in the preceding 25 years of selling that message.
And if we go back to Larry's 90s and the Information Infrastructure Task Force,
Yes.
we can also use what we know about the internet and education, the internet to support
Healthcare.
health, the internet.
Aging populations,
Exactly.
agriculture.
So we can be much more applied and work through those application domains.
I would also add, I think we dismiss too lightly the idea that a lot of these emerging markets are rodents. There are lions, there are apex predators in every market, and we can create a new model, a US, if you will, a competitor model perhaps, but we can create a new model that works for multiple markets, but we need to do it in conjunction with partners.
So name one in Europe. Name an apex predator in the internet economy in Europe. I just don't. I think it's going to be very hard.
I think, but I think if I can suggest, remember that apex predators are, a cat can be an apex predator if in your house, right? I mean, I think we have this vision of only lions and tigers, and on a regional basis, an apex predator in Nigeria might be big for Nigeria.
She tries
that's
it in my
200 million
house, she's
people.
leaving.
well, and there's some.
I think we have partners that we're missing out on in the construction of this new model, and that's good news for us if we play our cards right.
And there's some pretty big telecom players in Latin America as well.
For
So, all right, go ahead. Where do you think things are going and why?
Oh, actually, I had yeah, my name is Andrew Bridges. I'm a partner at Fenwick & West in Mountain View, California. I am very cynical and I fear the techlash because of everything that's happened in the last couple of years, which tech companies, I think, have unfortunately contributed to because they have promised solutions that they cannot deliver. I think the problems that we've seen with social media and the like may emanate from the architecture and practices of technology companies, but I think ultimately the public has a great deal of responsibility for what we've seen, and it's what we place more responsibility on individuals. And as long as tech companies keep touting that they are so bright that they can create all the solutions, we're not going to get a way out of this. But I had a question about the fragmentation, because this was a fantastic panel. Thank you very much. But it seems to me we're going to have a series of fragmentations and asymmetrical fragmentations, and the questions of fragmentations may not be that different from questions about tariffs. So for example, it may be US policy that we will welcome all of the internet to our door, that we will be able to access everything. But the problem is that persons in other countries will not be able to access everything. Those governments will choose what the citizens can access, and maybe they won't have access to American sources. And when we say fragmentation is bad, we may not experience that fragmentation because we may have access to everything. But what we're going to be saying is that other people should not like the fragmentation they have chosen. And that goes sort of to Marilyn's point that this is a very US-centric view. We can determine how much internet we want, but are we telling the rest of the world that they should not determine differently from us how much internet they want? Thank you.
Yeah, I think if the internet succeeds, as it has in Italy, it's going to feel like an Italian internet, and the Italians are perfectly entitled to say we want rules for our internet that reflect Italian values. And our decision to say no, you get Silicon Valley values like everybody else is just kind of aggravating everybody. And the result is you get heavy regulation and $5 billion fines in Europe. And in other places, you get the Chinese saying to Erdogan in Turkey, you can build an internet that has Chinese values and then tweak them slightly so they're Turkish values. And that's going to have a big impact on the competition. And I should stop here just for 1 second and say, if you find this challenging or interesting or worth listening to, I do have a weekly cyber law podcast that you can listen to. And I tell all my left-wing friends that you can go to the gym and just listen to the podcast and your heart rate will get over 100.
Can you come over here?
It's already over 100.
Right here in the blue blazer. I'm trying to switch the geography up a little bit here.
Thanks. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. The tee up this was the notion of the future of work. And I think that the question we're not looking at is what will life be like for workers in the future, for those individuals, those human beings. And you came close on your scenario for Wide Open, where you introduced this concept that Ron and I both were really intrigued by, this engagement index, a notion of measuring, are people getting as much work as they want, and are they satisfied? Well, today, at least, when we ask people if they're satisfied with their jobs, they say three things. Is it meaningful to me? Am I rewarded for my effort and initiative? And the third element is control. Do I have some control over the nature of what I do and when I do it? Well, it turns out on that measure of satisfaction, the internet is awfully good at supporting these peer-to-peer economy jobs where people can control when and how they work and actually can manage more closely how they're rewarded. So I think that has potential for people that are of that ilk. But as Larry said, it's not so good on protection or certainty. So that if we believe, we aspire that the internet would help us create a scenario of the future where people are engaged and satisfied, but also fully protected and certain, I don't know that that's going to be possible. We may have to look at a world where it's bifurcated between those who do have entrepreneurial inclinations, for which the internet's based information and frictionless is going to be superb. But for those who actually want certainty and protection, I don't yet know the role the internet will play at providing certainty and protection. So I would ask you to focus your thoughts on whether the scenarios are getting to what we do to help people feel satisfied with the work they'll have in the future. And if you have anything to share on that, I'd appreciate it.
So one of the things I had mentioned before was the availability through the internet of mechanisms for you to train yourself to do something new. So that goes back to the point earlier about agency. And I remember talking with somebody about how you can even learn welding on the internet, which is a little scary to me, but obviously the potentials are broad. The second comment I'd make is that I heard a radio piece in the last week about people having side hustles, and the commentator said, actually, this was a good thing and everybody should have a side hustle. My guess is the internet will be very helpful in researching and acting on that drive for side hustles. Yes.
So I think that the distinction that I would draw, I did a kind of a TED Talky thing a couple of years back about micro-franchising. And one of the lines that I emphasized in it was that not everybody's going to be an entrepreneur, but everybody can be more entrepreneurial. And I think that's the thing that we want to try to tease out of it if we can. The question is whether we're going to create a struggle economy or that we're going to create a more open economy with more options. And that's where the secret sauce, I think, comes in, trying to guarantee the basic levels of, you need to have a certain level of calorie intake in order to be entrepreneurial, I think. And so we want to make sure that we get to that floor one way or the other. I don't know whether we can do it by fiat, but I know that we need that in order to unlock that entrepreneurial spirit around the world.
One of the great, really kind of unsung successes of the American economy in the last 10 years has been the development and complete dominance by U.S. firms of cybersecurity as a field, and it's a very effective. It's a great living. And I remember talking to a student at Brown who had done some early side hustle stuff in this area that was very effective, and he said something that I think is true for a lot of us. He said, "Well, in cybersecurity, you're either self-taught or you aren't any good." That's the world we're all going to live in, I think. We're all going to have to become self-taught, and we're going to have to reteach ourselves every 5 years the ways in which new technology affects us. For some people, that is a really exciting opportunity, and it doesn't matter how educated you are. It's a question of, do you have the moxie and the enthusiasm? But boy, a lot of other people are not going to have that. Even if you've got it, you get in a car accident, you don't know what you're going to do.
I hope we rethink education policy and education provision in this country, because we've got some significant problems. On the workforce front, we have an industrial age education system. We rethought education moving from agriculture to industrial. We haven't rethought education moving from industrial to information society and a gig economy and owning your own business and being yourself an agency and all the great words that people of college educations think of. We have a great resource in community colleges that is underutilized. We can use online tools, but there's also an anti-education, anti-intellectualism thing that's going through the country. 2 books if you haven't read it. If you haven't read Hillbilly Elegy, inside that book, there's a lot of folks in the middle of this country who really think education is a detriment to life in this country. And there's another book, The Great Revolt, that talked about why so many people in the Midwest voted for Donald Trump. And I grew up in a community in Southeast Queens, New York, where going to college, like a Northwestern, was beyond what most people thought people in that community could do. And there was why are you doing that, bro? You don't need to do that. It's even worse, it seems like, in working class white America. There was a study in California, of all places. 2/3 of white Californians thought that their children did not or should not go to college, as compared to 60% of Asian parents who want their kids to go to college, 57% of black parents want to get, and 53% of Latino kids. 2/3 of white parents didn't think their kids needed to or should go to college. That's a problem in this country. And if we don't rethink education and reach where the people are, we're not going to be successful.
College sucks these days.
Yeah, that's right. I think it
owning an entire house for having learned European history.
Right, and there are alternatives to community colleges and things like that, there's other ways to get educated. I think part of the issue, again, is this look forward versus look backward, though. If you're an economic development officer in a state, and there's the old expression that if all you have is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail, right? And I have the power to give away land or give breaks on taxes, et cetera, in order to bring, I'm talking to Amazon, what I'm going to ask them is, put a distribution center in my state. When I should be asking, can you help me to get my citizens' businesses online? Because that's what Amazon's actually set up to help them do. Right? They're not set up to try and find your way back to the old economy. And so, I think part of what we need to do is figure out how to, again, come up with these solutions, but in a forward-thinking way instead of a backward-thinking way. Others, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
All right, so this is, my name is Clayton Banks from Silicon Harlem, and I just had 2 quick points and a question. So one point is, I think broadband has to be very much a utility, if you will, for all of this to work. So as we're looking at the future of work, everyone has to be connected. And it's not a zero-sum game. We got to get out of this language of the other. It's all of us. Even if you have a really good broadband connection, a better broadband connection will bring more money into your household. The second thing, to your point, when you talked about the future and how is it going to be designed, it's got to be co-designed. I think we have to have the government, the private sector, the academics, and what's been missing most of the industrial revolutions is the community. What do they really want? This still boils down to people. And my question is telework. As you guys think about the future, at least from my opinion, telework is going to play a big role, and there's got to be more governance around that. I believe Representative Connolly just introduced a bill around that. So I'd love to hear what you guys are thinking around telework.
So telework has obviously been around for a while, has grown certainly in this city. Government historically, maybe a little bit less so now, has often encouraged it for various reasons, and certainly anecdotally what I see in the private sector is people of all kinds, yes, are fulfilling the vision of working anywhere, anytime. I'm not sure I understand what you mean about governance about it. In general, the people that I know who tend to do telework possibly work more than they would have if they had been in an office for a variety of reasons, and one can argue about whether there would be governance of that. But I agree with you to make those opportunities available, especially for people who have mobility impairments, other disabilities. You do definitely broaden access to work to the extent that telework is genuinely supported.
There is government structure around it, so I would suggest we all read that recent bill that's being proposed, because there's been some pullback on some of the protections of people that telework versus what we've had in the past. So there's some evolving governance that's going on around telework.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I would just suggest that we all telework. I don't really think we think of it in these ways. I'm on the phone with Colombia yesterday morning, right, over WhatsApp. That's telework. I mean, I wasn't able to go there physically. I think you mentioned something else, though, that I think is super important, which is we need to do this in a way that creates community and creates trust. Because this, in a lot of ways, we're moving out of the data economy and into a trust economy, where your networks and the trusted nature of your networks really matter a lot. And so I think one of the questions that we have to answer is, how do we create that trust? How do we create the structures and the systems that engender more trust in the future, especially so that we can go into new business models? And that sense of community, I think, we're really struggling with that. We're trying to reverse engineer, as Jonathan mentioned.
Well, and that's another area where there's a sort of an old conception of community and potentially a new conception of community. And as Mr. Del Bianco asked about the role of the internet, one of the roles of the internet is in creating virtual communities that allows people to have groups, the communication, et cetera, solace, et cetera, that is outside of a physical community. Because a lot of people, when we start talking about personal agency, are concerned about labor mobility and people's ability to move to where work is or to be able to work from where they are. And a lot of that is going to require the government to get engaged in spending as much time removing the barriers to entrepreneurship, to labor mobility that we've set up over the past decades. Robert Guerra was online and asked a question for the panel, which is, who do you think are the three top people that you think we should be watching or listening to or reading on this topic? And you don't have to come up with three. But that was his question. Who are the leaders in this area that people ought to be paying attention to? Some of you have already mentioned some, but if you want to add to that, that was his question online.
So look, I mean, obviously everybody's looking at what Tristan Harris and Roger McNamee are saying and doing, because they are actually, they're fighting the castle and attacking it. I think it's going to be interesting to see what Ro Khanna comes up with. I don't know what he's going to do, and I don't really know him. We are both Commerce alums, but the fact that Pelosi gave the guy who's got Silicon Valley in his backyard the mantle to push for a progressive internet Bill of Rights for Americans, that should be interesting.
Anybody else want to add?
I would just say, from the economist side of the world, Otor at MIT always has interesting things to say, and importantly about understanding the nature of work, how it can be alternatively packaged into jobs, and avoiding naive and simple discussions of displacement.
Oh, and there's a woman columnist at Financial Times, and for whatever reason I'm having a senior moment and I'm forgetting it. But any of you will ask, I will post it on Twitter later today, because she's fantastic in terms of looking at the international implications of a lot of this, and has really looked. Oh, I can't think of her name at the moment. It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't get there. But there are some really good folks in Financial Times and economists, and I think it's important for particularly Americans to see what people outside of America are saying, writing, and thinking on this, because we don't want this just to be a domestic conversation.
All right. Thanks very much. Unfortunately, we are pressed for time. Please reach out to the panelists in the lobby. My name is Jonathan Zuck, and I'm with an organization called the Innovators Network that's focused on the future of work. So please come up to me if you'd like to be a part of conversations that we hold as well. But thanks so much for your participation in this panel, and enjoy the rest of the day. And thanks for joining me in thanking the panel.